In Springfield, Missouri, on Easter Sunday 1906, two black men, Horace Duncan and Fred Coker, falsely accused of rape, were dragged from jail by a mob of over 2,000 people to Park Central Square, where they were hanged at a rendition of the Statue of Liberty. After that, the mob returned and took Will Allen, who had been accused of murdering a white man, gave him a mock trial and lynched him as well.
Would you bow your heads and pray with us? Our Father.
On October 2nd, 2019, over 110 years later, a monument retelling what happened to those men, as well as African Americans in Springfield, was erected in Park Central Square. It is the first of 16 planned projects and was premiered with several speakers. Plenty of important people showed up, but the majority of the crowd was made up by students come to learn about the history of African American Springfield, a tumultuous history still ongoing. At the end of the 2018-2019 school year, a video surfaced at KHQ High School on Snapchat of a freshman calling to lynch African American members of the football team. At the time the video was released, it sparked a police investigation, and while the student has since been expelled, the video drove interest in greater diversity, as well as civil rights in the school system. This led to a September 2019 report on disciplinary actions in Springfield Public Schools, which showed that African American students were disciplined 23% compared to 17% of across-the-board disciplinary actions. And although it was down from 11.8 days, showed that they missed 9.1 days due to suspensions, more on average than Hispanic, low-income, and special education students also polled.
I think some of that comes from just living in a very racialized society, how the media portrays individuals, what we consider to be threat, how do we look at anger, how do we look at children's activity. Sometimes within different cultures, the same activity can be perceived very differently. And so sometimes that can result in a discipline. And unfortunately, once a child gets labeled certain ways in terms of discipline, it's much easier for that path to continue. So I think that's one of the challenges.
Lyle Foster is an associate professor of sociology and anthropology at Missouri State University, who specializes in community development and African American community in Springfield. Foster talked about the need for more diverse education in our school systems as critical.
But representation does matter. Research says that. So we do need to cultivate more teachers of color, particularly African American males, in our schools, because we actually are very disproportionate nationally and locally in terms of the amount of people of color in our public schools.
Other professors like Jury's Dr. Richard Scher, a professor of African American literature, pointed out the fact that Springfield's development, especially the development of schools like KHQ, which is considered the wealthiest public school in Springfield, was directly affected by white flight from African Americans.
What do kids know? Well, if you go to KHQ and you went swimming in Fast Night, that's a very raced history of what you're experiencing, which they might not even know. And they're not choices that their parents made, it's not choices that their grandparents made, it's just how the city has been constructed. So, okay, I'll give you a few other things. Okay, this is really good. So, probably to get here from KHQ, you had to drive on Campbell Street, right? Well, Campbell was one of the major slave owners in Springfield before the Civil War. So, in many towns, they have been trying to scrub the names of people who were involved in the Confederacy and slave owners. Well, Campbell was a slave owner. I think John Phelps of Phelps Grove Park was a slave owner, I think. If you look at the list of the top 5 slave owners in Springfield before the war, I think they all have streets named after them. So that's a really interesting question, right? Like, it's even in our geography, again, in our place names. Weaver Street, if you're familiar with Weaver, they were a big slave-owning family as well. And so, so imagine if you go to KHQ, you drive up Campbell to go to Fast Night Pool, your entire journey is one based on the racial history of Springfield.
Dr. Scher talked about the importance of educating students on racial issues, parroting the dedication of the memorial, and that understanding how to interact with each other is systemic to the larger issue of conquering racism in school settings. He took his class to the memorial for that exact reason, hoping that they would be able to learn more about what happened in Springfield and how they could develop beyond it. At one point during the dedication, a representative from the Equal Justice Initiative, a foundation started by civil rights lawyer and activist Brian Stevenson, started speaking. The representative preached a variety of issues, including how African American culture is influenced by inherent racism, a concept Dr. Scher regards in his teachings of African American literature. Most importantly to the initiative's goals, however, she delivered a sermon calling for legal justice. Legal troubles for African Americans across the United States have long been an issue. The criminal justice fact sheet from the NAACP reported that since 1980, prison populations have quadrupled, with African Americans locked up at 6 times the rate of whites. For Elad Gross, a former assistant attorney general now running to be the Attorney General of Missouri, his experience working pro bono for the state's public defender system gave him a lot of encounters with both adults and children.
I have visited a number of schools because I do a lot of work in education. I've been doing that for a long time now. But I go to a number of schools to see, and one of the first questions I ask is, how do you deal with kids who act up in class? And there's a lot of different ways to deal with it. In some schools, they call a police officer in, and that kid is arrested, and that kid is charged with something, and maybe they have to go through the juvenile justice system. Oftentimes, that's not the most effective way to deal with the kid. Sometimes a kid is just acting up, right? And we have to figure out, what do we do?
The school-to-prison pipeline explains that since over half of prisoners don't have a high school GED, part of the issue is an educational one. Around 2 million parents are locked up, which increases the likelihood that their children will be locked up. For others, however, being in the wrong place at the wrong time could be enough to send a child to jail.
We have a public defender system in Missouri that is extremely overburdened. I volunteered as a special public defender when I left the Attorney General's office, and I represented somebody who was 18 years old, who lost 7 months of her life in jail for a crime that she did not commit, and that she actually cooperated with police and told them who was involved and everything else. And the eyewitnesses corroborated her story, but she sat there. And then she was held there for 15 days without any charges against her because they just didn't let her out.
Part of Elad's campaign centers on reforms to the state's public defender system. In Missouri, the lack of funds in the public defender system results in many staying forced in jail, with cases not being heard for months. In 2017 alone, the state's 370 attorneys handled more than 82,000 cases. In 2018, Missouri's public defender system was cited in a report by the Sentencing Project to the United Nations on xenophobia and racism in the U.S. legal system, calling out the fact that poor African Americans are more likely to use and are more likely to be harmed by an underfunded public defender system. Despite that, national attention towards African American issues is taking a central stance in the 2020 presidential election, following the passage of a federal lynching ban as well as the First Step Act. Locally in Springfield, more African American businesses are starting up. Larry Flanoy Jr., an African American business owner and candidate for city council, announced plans to challenge incumbent Mayor Ken McClure in the 2021 election cycle. Springfield Public Schools recently hired a full-time diversity coordinator to combat racism and make sure that all students feel safe in schools. And throughout all of Springfield, people will be learning the names of 3 men.
So let's say their names together. Horace Duncan. Fred Coker. Will Allen.